Movie 1. The movie opens up on a busy underground train station. A man approaches and sits down on a bench waiting for his train. Although he looks like an ordinary city man trying to get to work, there is something really odd about him. The man's head is made up of several sliced-up sections that are completely jumbled up, like a Rubik's Cube. The hair that's supposed to be on his head is on the chin region, while his nose and right eye are on the top of his head. Only his ear is exactly where it's supposed to be. Despite this oddity, the man remains calm. After looking at his watch, he realizes that there is a bit of time until his train arrives. So he goes to work on his head and starts moving around the sliced-up sections. This strange sight starts to draw people's attention. The sweeper, who was busy in his work earlier, stops and stares at the man in disbelief. Similarly, other passengers are left speechless when they see him with the Rubik's Cube head. Meanwhile, despite trying several combinations, the man cannot arrange his face the normal way. He sits there confused and decides to take a sip from his hydration drink. Re-energized by the refreshing taste, he once again starts rearranging his face, much to the amusement of a little girl who is watching him intently. In the final scene, after several complex moves and combinations, the man is finally able to put all the sections of his face in the correct position. Satisfied, he puts earphones in his ears and struts to a song peacefully. Movie 2. The second movie opens up on a sunny afternoon in London as businessman Dio walks down the road with his young daughter Laura by his side. Despite being on lunch break, he is constantly busy on his phone, taking calls from his work. Fed up, Laura drifts away from him in order to draw his attention. Just as she had hoped for, Dio immediately ends the call and catches up to her. Laura then playfully asks him to dance with her. She shows him the steps, and together they bust a few moves. From their conversation, it's revealed that Laura has her first ever stage performance at her school later that day, but Dio won't be able to attend it as he's got several business meetings lined up. Just as the father and daughter approach a crossing, a bicycle suddenly zooms past, dangerously close to them. Had they been only a few inches ahead, a serious accident could have occurred. This jolts Dio emotionally, and he's reminded of how much he treasures his little daughter. So he calls up his colleague and postpones all work meetings so that he can attend her dance performance. Following this, they meet up with Laura's mother, Amanda. The little girl embraces her and shares that Dad will be staying for her performance. This is surprising news for Amanda, but she welcomes it wholeheartedly and kisses her husband. However, the wholesome moment is interrupted when Dio receives yet another call from his work. Just as he steps away for a moment, people behind him suddenly begin panicking and scattering. He turns around to see a terrifying scene. A man dressed in all black with a knife covered in blood in front of Laura and Amanda. Dio begs the man not to do anything, but it falls on deaf ears. The man then lunges forward to stab Amanda. She manages to avoid the knife, but it strikes Laura. In an even more horrific turn, the man throws Laura's body over the edge onto the traffic below. Shocked, Dio rushes to the attacker and tackles him down while calling out for his daughter. Meanwhile, a dazed Amanda sees her daughter go over the edge and tries to go after her. Unfortunately, she too falls to her death. A whole year has passed, and the man in the stabbing incident is convicted by a jury. Dio has now left his previous job and works as a ride-share driver. However, he has been ignoring the welfare checks from the crisis management department. Instead, he spends his free time listening to saved voice messages of Amanda on his phone. Meanwhile, he drives all kinds of passengers to their destinations, each passenger with their own stories. Sometimes their plight resonates with him on an emotional level, but he just goes on with his day, trying to push on. Dio also meets with people who have the same work-first mentality as he did in the past. And every time, he realizes how foolish he was to think like that. One morning, Dio admires a picture of his family on his daughter's birthday. He's waiting in a parking lot when a couple approaches his vehicle since they have booked him for a ride home. Along with them is their young daughter, who reminds him of Laura. The couple are influencers and constantly bicker throughout their journey. Dio casts a sympathetic glance at the girl through his rearview mirror while her parents continue arguing. Soon afterwards, they finally reach home, and the parents head to the front door while their daughter remains behind in the car. Dio takes their stuff from the back and sets it down at their gate before turning back to ask the girl if she'd like to head inside. She reluctantly gets out and walks toward the gate, but suddenly she turns around and embraces Dio from behind. This overwhelms him with emotions, and he drops to the floor crying. The girl looks like Laura, and a hug from her opens the floodgates of his inner core. After this momentary outpouring of grief, Dio feels lighter and gets up. He gets back into his car, appearing to have a slightly fresh perspective and the confidence to face whatever comes next. Movie 3. The third movie opens up as Timber Woods arrives at his bungalow to discover his partner Harry Hope lying in bed acting strangely. Unlike his usual self, Harry is whispering and sweating all over. He tells Timber that a crate, an extremely poisonous little snake, crawled onto the bed and is now sleeping between his stomach and the sheet. Following this, Timber goes to the kitchen and gets a knife. He plans to use it to cut the infected skin and suck out the poison. However, Harry tells him to call the local doctor, Dr. Ganderby. Thankfully, the doctor agrees to come as soon as possible. Once he arrives, he quickly decides that the first thing to do is inject Harry with some snakebite serum. He then carefully rolls up his pajama sleeve and ties on a rubber tourniquet. Meanwhile, Harry struggles not to move or cough as he fears this might agitate the snake. Ganderby then smoothly inserts the needles and administers the serum. Outside, the doctor tells Timber that the serum is by no means a guarantee of safety. After a brief discussion, they decide to anesthetize the snake. They then head inside and use chloroform to soak the mattress beneath Harry. The process is agonizing and takes a long time. Eventually, they begin to slowly lift the sheet off Harry, with hopes that the snake is unconscious. However, they see no sign of the snake. Ganderby suggests it could be up the leg of his pajamas. Hearing this, Harry goes berserk and leaps to his feet, shaking his legs violently. When he stops, they realize that he hasn't been bitten and the snake is nowhere to be seen. Surprised, Ganderby asks Harry if he really saw a snake in the first place. But this only enrages the latter, and he accuses Ganderby of calling him a liar. When the doctor doesn't reply, Harry begins screaming horrible racist insults at him. Harry is a British official working in British-ruled India, while Ganderby is a local Indian doctor. Hence, he quickly leaves without replying to anything. In the final scene, Timber stops the doctor outside and apologizes for Harry's behavior. He then thanks the doctor for his help. Before quietly driving off, Ganderby satirically says that all Harry needs is a good holiday. Movie 4. The final movie opens as a middle-aged man named Sidney walks in on his son Isaiah pleasuring himself. Despite being embarrassed, Sidney explains that it's natural for a young man to engage in such activities. After he leaves, it's shockingly revealed that the photo which Isaiah was using to pleasure himself was in fact a picture of Sidney, his own father. As time passes, Isaiah's attraction towards his father grows rapidly, and he becomes more and more aggressive. 14 years later, during Isaiah's wedding reception, his mom, Joan, goes searching for her husband. To her horror, she discovers Sidney being abused by her son. However, she does not do anything about it. She wipes her tears and walks away like nothing happened. For years, Sidney was scared of telling people about his ordeal, but he has reached the point where he can no longer endure the abuse. As a result, he decides to write a tell-all book about everything he's been facing for over a decade. One night, as he's working on his book, he hears footsteps behind him. He tries to exit out of the page, but the computer suddenly glitches. Thankfully, he shuts down the computer just before Isaiah arrives and calls him for dinner. At dinner, Isaiah tries to give him a gift, but Sidney declines it. Joan then tries to lighten up the mood, but Isaiah explains that he got this gift specifically for his father. He then begins rubbing on his father's leg underneath the table. After several weeks, Sidney eventually completes his book and decides it's time to walk out on his family for good. Before leaving, He places the completed manuscript underneath his wife's pillow. Unfortunately, as he heads out into the hallway, he's intercepted by Isaiah, who claims his toilet is broken and needs to use theirs. Scared, Sydney tries to keep him from going into their room, but fails. That night, Isaiah approaches Sydney in his office after finding the copy of his manuscript. He is outraged that his father would dare expose their relationship. Threatening to burn it, he warns that next time, the consequences will be a lot worse than a simple conversation. This scares Sydney, so he immediately deletes the file containing his manuscript. After hosting a New Year's party for all their friends and family, Sydney decides to unwind with a relaxing bath and music. But Isaiah has other plans for him. He breaks open the door and attacks him in the bathtub, violating him. Mom hears his screams from downstairs, but she cannot do anything about it. That night, Sydney makes a choice to run away as he can no longer stand his son's abuse. Luckily, he's hidden a copy of his manuscript under a loose floorboard. He tries to sneak away, but Isaiah is already downstairs waiting for him. He's enraged that his father only sees the relationship as one-sided. Fearing that he will be assaulted once again, Sydney rushes out of the door. But when he reaches the middle of the street, he doesn't see a truck driving towards him. Unfortunately, he gets hit and passes away on the spot. Isaiah screams in horror as his father dies right in front of his eyes. The scene then cuts to a few days later when Joan is forced to think about all the times she ignored her husband. She realizes that all he needed was somebody to help him. With this realization, Joan finally confronts her son. She starts by asking him about the day of his prom night when Sydney went to drop him at the school. However, when he returned back home, he was crying and could not look Joan in the eyes. At first, Isaiah pretends like he doesn't know what she's talking about. But the longer she presses, the more agitated he becomes, until eventually he comes clean. Enraged, she accuses him of killing his father before slapping him. He slaps her back, claiming that he loved his father better than she ever did. This results in a tussle between the two, and Joan eventually kills her own son out of self-defense.